Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C., where we're at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at the conclusion of a panel discussion, but also the introduction of a fascinating new report, Avoiding, Crossed Out, Coping with Surprise in Great Power Conflicts. It was written by Mark Cancian, a retired United States Marine Corps colonel, who is one of the sharp minds here. Mark, great to see you. And also we've got Tom Mahnken, who's the president and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, another one of the think tanks that has spent many years looking at the issue of strategic surprise and how to deal with it. An alumni, an Andy Marshall alumni as well, and also formerly U.S. Navy and formerly Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy Planning, if I recall correctly. Tom, great to see you as well. Mark, let me start with you. Talk to us about sort of what you were trying to achieve with the report and what are sort of the key takeaways in how the United States can better cope with strategic surprise, the likes of which, you could argue we saw in Ukraine. There was a lot of discussion of the anti-satellite weapons test that China conducted some decade or so more ago. Talk to us a little bit about what the key takeaways are from your standpoint.
Where this report came from were three factors. Surprise has always been an element of war, but recently you've had the rise of great power competition, and that puts risks to the United States that we haven't experienced in the last 25 years. You also have a lot of technologies that are new and have not been used in combat. And then finally you have a hubris that has arisen from the United States fighting weak and isolated regional competitors and having military dominance. What we concluded was that some surprise is inevitable. Better intelligence and better analysis can be helpful, but because of weaknesses in human beings and the inevitable nature of surprise and of adversaries, there's going to be some surprise. So we wanted to think about how you would cope with that if you weren't going to be able to avoid it entirely. And we came to the conclusion there were sort of three categories of ways of coping. The first is anticipation, looking at not trying to predict the future, but looking at a range of possible futures so that whatever happens, people are accustomed to the idea that there are many different things that could happen and therefore would be less vulnerable to the unexpected. Also resilience, both mental and physical, so that when surprise occurs, institutions and individuals can cope. And then finally adaptation once conflict begins. How do you counter the sources of surprise?
And I should also say that two of the other participants, unfortunately, are not here to join us. Retired Lieutenant General Rooster Schmidl, who was the cost assessment and program evaluation chief, or the deputy director, I should say, in that office. Also deputy cyber commander, former also chief of Marine Corps aviation, who is an out-of-the-box thinker. And we also had Christine Wormuth, who was here, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under the Obama administration, is now at the Adrian Arsht Center. You mentioned resilience, and it reminded me to mention that Christine is over at the Atlantic Council. So, Tom, give us your take on how you see the challenge and some of the ways that the Pentagon can better cope.
Sure. So I would agree with what Mark said in that surprise is endemic. And at one level, surprise is about what adversaries do to us, that they intentionally seek to surprise us by deceiving us, by denying us information. But all too often, surprise is what we do to ourselves. And at one level, it's a reflection of just human mental pathologies, cognitive pathologies, the way we process information. So I would agree that at some level, surprise is unavoidable. But I think there still are things that we can do to do better, to study what contemporary warfare and future warfare is really going to be like, and that may be very different from our experience of the last 25 years, to study deeply our competitors and our adversaries and the way they see things and the way that they may see things differently, to study deeply trends in technology and where technology may be taking us, and again, to places very different than we've experienced in the past. And I think through those things, through efforts to mitigate, to adapt, we can at least marginally improve our ability to avoid surprise, and certainly more than marginally influence our ability to adapt and recover after being surprised.
Let me take you, and I want to go to you, Mark, but I want to start, you mentioned, during the panel discussion that the military tends to reward people with operational experience, but unfortunately some of those people who get rewarded might not be the people that we need for future conflict. Talk to us a little bit about that, and what are some ways that perhaps military, and I want to go to examples of what were successful organizations that responded to surprise. But talk to us about that leadership issue and whether or not we're actually doing ourselves a disservice, or how do you identify? Give me an example of a good military leader who came up along a certain way, because I think you mentioned John Pershing as one of those leaders. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So, understandably, militaries reward excellence, success on the battlefield. It's completely understandable. But success in one setting, is not necessarily a predictor of success in a very, very different setting. The U.S. military has, we've been fighting 2 decades of a particular type of war in a particular geographic setting. And so it's not surprising that the current leadership, probably our future leadership of our military, will have been shaped in very fundamental, very personal ways by those experiences. But what we need to find are people that can draw upon some of those experiences, can learn some of the right lessons, but aren't really hidebound by them, aren't really fundamentally limited by them, that can also see the possibility of very different types of wars. And yeah, the example of John Pershing is a great one. Here's an officer who started out fighting the Indian Wars in the American Midwest, who dealt with the Buffalo Soldiers, led the Buffalo Soldiers, Black Cavalry unit, was dealt with the insurgency, the Philippine insurrection, led the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in the American Southwest, and then ultimately led the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. So everything from advisory support, counterinsurgency, to big Army level, Corps level operations in Europe in one individual. He was an extraordinary individual. I don't think any officer could have done that. So part of what militaries need to do are understand and identify those traits that are needed, and then to promote them among the officer corps and among civilians as well.
And it was an extraordinary time with the confluence of so many new technologies that came at the same time in a high-intensity, great power competition. Mark, talk to us a little bit about some examples of strategic surprise and folks who have coped well with that strategic surprise, and people who have coped perhaps less well with strategic surprise.
I think a classic example of coping well were the Israelis in 1973, when they first ran into advanced technology, surface-to-air missiles. In 1967, their Air Force had dominated the ground. In 1973, they found that the opposition was much more effective, but they developed countermeasures within days and weeks that allowed them to penetrate the Arab air defenses. So they reacted very quickly. An example that's sort of both good and bad is the United States response to IEDs in Iraq. On the one hand, we did have a succession of adaptations for our ground vehicles. We start with unarmored Humvees, and then we put on what people have called the Mad Max armor, the improvised armor. Then we have up-armored Humvees, and then finally we have MRAPs. So we really do adapt. The problem we had was it just took too long, and that we took a lot of casualties, and that being our strategic weakness, our weak point, that undermined the entire effort.
Talk to us a little bit about the broader organism, right? General Schmidl, but also Christine Wormuth, sort of mentioned the same sort of thing. Is the speed tends not to be our strong suit. The good news is we may have done things years before, but we didn't implement them. What are some different ways that the entire organism, and General Schmidl, ended this on the sort of whole of government. We need to think differently and not just about the military piece of this. Talk to us about how sort of this can be handled in a different way higher up, whether it's at the White House. I mean, where's the way to do this, to do some of this thinking through on what some of these challenges are? Because if you actually study them, it's actually not that surprising that some of our adversaries would do what it is that we might think that they might do to us.
I think you have to take a multi-pronged approach, aiming at all different levels. For example, for the leadership, the role of war games and experiments can be very helpful, opening up the aperture to many different possible futures. Not necessarily trying to predict the right future, but the notion that there are many different futures, some of which are going to be very adverse. To change the whole institution, you need to do something more broad-based, changing the doctrine, and there, I think, particularly actually, professional military publications have a great role, because if they're left unfettered, that's a way for the military to have a discussion about alternatives in a way that the institutions themselves don't have to approve. So you can have these discussions in a way that the institution can hold them at arm's length, but still get people thinking about alternatives. And a great example of that is the Navy and carriers. There's a lot of debate about carrier vulnerability in the future. Will carriers be able to penetrate an A2AD environment, or will precision long-range munitions keep them outside? You're never going to really resolve that in peacetime, but the issue has been argued enough so that when wartime comes around, everybody's going to be watching for this. And the Navy has developed an alternative concept, which is distributed lethality, so that they can move to an alternative if they have to, and that's happened in the professional military press.
And that was former commander of Naval Surface Forces, Tom Roden's big initiative. He recently was replaced by Admiral Brown. Talk to us, Tom. Give us your take on that as well.
Yeah, to my mind, I agree with what Mark said, but to my mind, it all starts with having a competitive mindset. And I mean, to realize that we have competitors out there, we have adversaries out there who are trying their hardest to defeat us, including trying to innovate, to exploit our weaknesses, and that similarly, we need to be competing with them. We need to be seeking advantage. And just as they're trying to inflict surprise upon us, we need to be thinking about ways to inflict surprise upon our adversaries. If we have that competitive mindset and express that, through professional military education, through training, through exercises, through war games, through senior leader direction, I think we're going to be much better off.
And that's obviously something that H.R. McMaster has been talking about since he became National Security Advisor.
I think, both in the national security strategy, national defense strategy, the word competition, appears quite frequently, and I think that's good. Of course, competition is different than conflict. It's also different than cooperation. But acknowledging that we're in a competitive environment and trying to succeed, which means trying to advance American interests and American values, something we need to be doing.
One last question to you both. Is the key, what do you think the keys are to getting that agility, to getting that speed that we need? Is it a less zero failure tolerance mentality? I mean, what are the mentality changes that that Jim Mattis can be doing as Defense Secretary starting now? Bob Work tried to work this issue. Ash Carter tried to work this issue. It started under Secretary Hagel in terms of trying to think differently about the challenges facing the nation. What are some clear things that have to change? Because if there are pockets of creative thought, but it's in a system that's still stifling and doesn't reward innovation, then you have a potential problem.
Yeah, and because people have wrestled with this question of innovation for a long time, and I don't think there's any really good answer. One thing on surprise in particular, the notion of stressing to breaking is important. That is, putting people in situations where the force is not going to do well. In fact, they might lose, and opening the possibility then that you may have to do something very different. You have to think more broadly about the problem. I think that can help.
Yeah, I think it starts with seriousness, an attitude of seriousness, that we face serious challenges, and so much so that we could lose. Not that we're the greatest military that the world has ever seen, but that we could actually lose a future war. And we'll lose it if we don't pay attention to the military profession and what needs to be done, and putting people in the situation of figuring out how not only not to lose, but how to win, and being very serious about it, conveying the risks of failure, but also being tolerant of failure if it's in the broader service of overall success.
Tom Mahnken of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, thanks very much. And Mark Cancian of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, thanks very much for having us. Great report. And you have one more plug?
We do. We have a video, a 3-minute video. It goes with the report so that for people with short attention spans or not very much time, I think they can get the summary, and it's quite well done by our video lab.
You guys have a great video lab and the executive summary as well, and they'll be all up. Links will all be on our website. Guys, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.